Kioxa's IPO is good to go. Cisco gets robust. NVIDIA Blackwell goes big. Apica adds telemetry. VMware VCF is over 9. Veeam takes the top spot, and we've got hot chips news galore in this episode of the Gestalt IT Rundown. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Gestalt IT Rundown for today, which is August 28th. My name is Tom Hollingsworth, and it is a very important national holiday for everyone out there. It is, in fact, National Power Rangers Day. And if you couldn't guess, my favorite one is Tommy. Rest in peace, Jason David Frank. But joining me is my Blue Ranger, my backup, my second in command, of course, Mr. Stephen Foskett. Stephen, welcome to the Rundown.
It's wonderful to be here, Tom, on National Red Wine Day, because sometimes red wine is what you need.
Yes, red wine, Red Rangers. We have everything you're going to need today, including all of the news about all of the exciting things that have been going on in tech. And we're going to start off with money, because that's the most important thing, right? Because it's IPO time for our friends over at Kioxa. The storage giant has filed paperwork with the Tokyo Stock Exchange to go public in October. They are valued at 1 trillion yen. If you want to do the math, that actually works out to be about $10.3 billion. And they've been planning to go public for several years now, but they've had a few roadblocks like COVID. And there was also kind of a cooling in the NAND storage market for a little while. But don't worry, they got all that figured out, and they're on track to go ahead and release this IPO. The primary investor in Kioxa is, of course, Bain Capital. They own the majority, but Toshiba has a 40% stake in the company as well. So I'm sure they're hoping to get some nice coin out of this. Stephen, why is Kioxa's IPO such big news?
Well, I don't know if it's big news, but as we talked about previously, and as we will be continuing to talk about here, there's a lot of movement happening right now in the storage market on the financial side. So Solidigm was split out from Intel and among others, and has been very successful as a company. In fact, Solidigm is really establishing themselves as a major player in the storage industry. That has led to the same trajectory for Kioxa, which is another maker of SSDs, and it could essentially be another Solidigm. So it's nice to see this. As noted, the valuation here is actually not quite what Kioxa had been seeking back in 2020, but frankly, a lot of things have changed since 2020. So it's nice to see that. I'd also like to note, by the way, that there's another potential move on the way in the storage industry that's very, very similar. The rumor is that Western Digital will be splitting out their flash business, which was kind of acquired from SanDisk. So basically, the Western Digital bought SanDisk. Well, according to financial analysts, Western Digital is now valued as if it doesn't even own SanDisk. And that has led to some of the private equity folks in the market to push Western Digital to split that back off again. Looks like that's probably going to happen as well. And hopefully the result will be called SanDisk. So we could end up, again, with a few major SSD powerhouse companies along with Solidigm, and with a much more profitable and solid Western Digital and Toshiba. So this all makes sense. You know, honestly, what's the implication for enterprise tech? Frankly, SSD and NAND technology has become incredibly important, and I think it's important to have companies that are focused on building great storage products to go along with the all the uses of enterprise storage today, and that's pretty much what we're seeing. Cisco has decided to make their AI security strategy a little bit more robust, literally. They're acquiring Israeli startup Robust Intelligence for an undisclosed amount. This move comes after a June announcement that Cisco would be investing $1 billion into various startups focused on AI. Robust Security was founded in 2021 by Yaron Singer, a Harvard mathematics professor, and has raised $44 million so far on a $200 million valuation. Tom, Cisco is really keen on getting into AI. In fact, we'll probably see them at some of our AI Field Day events this year. Why does Cisco want this math professor, and what's Cisco intending to do with AI?
Well, in this case, they're not just using AI to fuel some of their security products. They're providing AI on security models. That's what robust intelligence was designed to do, was to kind of use math to eliminate things like hallucinations. And that's something that we always talk about when it comes to these AI models. We all joke around about it. Fun fact, if you want a prime example of a hallucination, go ask your favorite AI assistant how many R's there are in the word strawberry. I don't think you're going to like its answer. That is one of the examples of what happens when either the system isn't figuring things out properly or it's been configured in such a way as to just kind of randomly come up with stuff. And so Cisco said, well, we're going to invest in companies that are trying to do things with security when it comes to AI. And this is one of those examples of, hey, we're going to put a little money into you and then we're going to get it back by buying you. And this also comes on the news that we've had that there's going to be some layoffs inside of Cisco because it is August and it's time for them to kind of look at retooling some of their workforce. But the biggest one, of course, was when Jonathan Davidson is departing from his head role of the networking side of things. He's going to transition to become more of an advisor to CEO Chuck Robbins, and Jitu Patel is taking over as the chief product officer for the company. One of the things that G2 had been tasked with was the security portfolio. And now we're seeing that security is a lot more than just traditional infrastructure security or software like IAM and things like that. It's securing these AI data models. And when you've got a company like NVIDIA who's running flat out in the market and making all of the money, and then people kind of look around and go, oh, yeah, the S in AI stands for security, kind of like the S in IoT stands for security. There needs to be some kind of way to do this. And a little note about our friend Yaron Singer. Not only is he a Harvard math professor, he is the youngest Harvard math professor to be tenured at age 40. That should tell you about his math skills. Way better than mine, which means he's done a really great job of building this platform. And, this was a small startup. They were really kind of focused on growth at this point. I mean, I think they said that the acquisition included just a handful of employees, which means they were buying this at an early stage. They must have seen something they really liked and they wanted to fold that in very quickly. And I know that there's a lot of brain trust inside of Cisco that are working very hard on AI things right now. So I'm very excited to see where this goes into the future. And I think that we're going to see some interesting moves like this coming from G2 Patel and his new role as Cisco moves forward. All right, it's 2024. Let me summarize this next story in 2 words: NVIDIA, AI. All right, let me give you a little bit more because it's Hot Chips Week, so there's a lot of news coming out. And NVIDIA was finally able to show off their Blackwell GPU data center clusters. This includes, if you're not familiar, the Grace CPU, the NVLink Switch 5 networking chip, Bluefield 3 DPU, and lots more. Also discussed during their presentation was something called the NVIDIA Inference Microservice, or NIM, which is a new concept for workloads that heavily leverages some features that are found in Blackwell. Now, Stephen, the question that I have, because I've seen the specs on Blackwell, and this is that crazy, like half rack water cooled nuclear power plant level thing. But then you talk about like inferencing microservices. Is NVIDIA trying to do less with more hardware?
Well, no. Um, NVIDIA is obviously running high or riding high on the incredible success of their hardware in data center AI training. But of course, they are also big producers of inferencing hardware. Essentially, they are rolling out the same type of silicon and tensor nodes and so on in PCI Express cards that look a lot like a graphics card, as well as larger and larger and larger systems, all the way up to the big, massive scale Grace supercomputers that we've talked about. So NVIDIA here, what they're doing is basically fitting in more software to help power this. This is one of those areas where I really think that the industry is turning a corner from a focus on AI training to a focus on practical applications for AI. That's what we talked about the last couple of weeks on the Tech Field Day podcast. If you want to listen in, a couple of weeks ago, it was the title was AI as we know it is just a fad, meaning AI focused only on these big AI supercomputers is just a fad. The next episode from yesterday was AI is not a fad, which is focused on the fact that there's a lot of other AI stuff coming down the pike that is actually going to be productive and valuable and reasonable to run and is not basically an AI supercomputer. Well, that's what we're talking about here. So, NVIDIA has a developer friendly software solution for inferencing using microservices. Essentially, it's containers and Kubernetes all the way down. It includes a lot of the open source software and frameworks that you would want if you're an AI developer and if you're trying to deploy AI in production, AI inferencing and localized retraining and that sort of thing. This would give you that capability in a software stack. This is really important because essentially that's the whole next ball game. The previous ball game was, can we train billion parameter AI models that are actually useful? And the answer is sure, yeah, we've done that. The next ball game is, can we actually deploy these things in production in a way that makes sense, in a way that's useful, in a way that's developer friendly? And that's the reason for AMD's acquisition, for example, of Silo AI, for a lot of the things that Intel has been doing, for a lot of the things that others have been doing as well, and for a lot of what we're seeing at Hot Chips, which we're going to discuss in our closer look. And that's really where NVIDIA comes in here. Essentially, NVIDIA has developed this really nice developer friendly framework to deploy applications, yeah, using NVIDIA hardware. And I'm really not surprised that this is the direction they're taking. It makes a lot of sense for them. It is exactly what they should be doing, and NIM actually does look pretty attractive from the standpoint of somebody who's trying to deploy AI models. Apica is adding a new way to see telemetry data in their platform. The new fleet data management offering allows for normalized data collection from applications to a central repository for easy viewing. This means a one-stop shop for DevOps to see how things are performing and where tweaks need to be made. In addition, fleet data management can be used to configure monitoring agents on application platforms to make things easier to collect and report. For more information on this, let's turn this story over to our friend Mike Vizard of DevOps.com, part of the TechStrong group.
I think what's really interesting about all this is we went from having a situation where we hardly instrumented anything because it was too expensive and it was too hard to roll out all these agents to now we have open source telemetry software rolling out that people are much more comfortable installing. It's harder than your typical commercial agent still, though. But we've wound up with maybe too much of a good thing. We've got so many agents now, the old commercial ones and the open source ones, that they all generate data, and guess what? It's not normalized. So now you got to pull all this data in, normalize it before you can do any analytics against it. And then once you get that analytics together, well, right now you still need to know what questions to ask. So we're all hoping that AI will eliminate the need for me to know what questions to ask because the algorithms will figure that out for us. But we're on the cusp of the next wave of observability is the good news. The bad news is we're discovering that it's a data management problem and we're once again not prepared.
Well, thanks a lot, Mike. If you're interested in Apica, by the way, we did have them present at Tech Field Day back in April of 22, and you can find that in your friendly neighborhood search engine. VMware Explore is happening this week, and all eyes are on their plans for the VMware Cloud Foundation. The newest revision of their platform skips a whole bunch of numbers from 5 to 9, and that means changes for users. According to CEO Hock Tan, who was interviewed by Futurum Group's own Daniel Newman and Patrick Moorhead, VCF is the private cloud for everyone. This has been in the works for a while, since we saw some of these features back at AI Field Day in February. Tom, what's your takeaway from this big news?
First of all, let me just say a congratulations to Hocktan and the VMware by Broadcom team for finally naming a product version 9. If you know anything about Windows and iPhone and everything else, we've seemed to skip 9 for some reason. I don't know why. So props to you. Now, of course, you jumped over 6, 7, and 8 to get there. But the question on everybody's lips is, why are we jumping all of these version numbers? Just watch Hocktan's keynote address. I'm telling you, if you've ever seen that scene in a movie when the player on the other side of the table pushes all of their chips into the middle, that's kind of what this felt like. I mean, some quotes, CIOs were convinced to go to the cloud years ago, and now you guys are all suffering from PTSD. That's a quote from the keynote. He was punchy. Like he was definitely like he was not playing around. And I think that you can see this is the strategy going forward, because this is what we've heard all year from people, right? Is the changes in the licensing model and the reduction in the number of SKUs. I mean, realistically speaking, you can get starter VMware or you can get VMware Cloud Foundation. There's no in between anymore. So what are they basically saying? What they're doing is they're putting their stake in the ground to be the private cloud company for anybody who's ready to bail out of the cloud. You know, whether it's costs or complexity or compliance, that are the three big C's that he talked about, that are reasons why people are moving back. He's like, well, you got to go somewhere, and we're basically the only game in town. Now, I've seen some numbers from people that are going to be releasing reports soon that say that there are a lot of people in the, if you want to call them the silent majority, of folks that are not complaining about the licensing model, or maybe they're not hit by those multi-$1,000 per server costs, that are perfectly content to be running all of their stuff on-prem. And when you look at the number of highly regulated industries that still do need to run things on-prem, I think what VMware is basically saying with Cloud Foundation 9 is, you might as well use us. And of course, they're still going to be offering VCF options for things like, you know, Microsoft Azure and Google Compute Engine. But I think that they're doing that more as a way of saying, why don't you go ahead and try this cloud thing out and see how well you like it? But we all know you're going to be back sooner or later. And I think that that's really where VMware is hoping to get some of their revenue from. There's always going to be laggards in the cloud, right? There's going to be groups that can never move for whatever reason, whether they have data sovereignty issues or they cannot stomach the idea of getting rid of their traditional on-premises infrastructure. And that kind of tracks a little bit with what Broadcom's model is they're always going to be going after those people who are kind of too big to be agile enough to just kind of jump on whatever the next trend is. And when you look at all of the other things that are going on with, you know, AI workloads and stuff like that, there are a lot of people who are still not 100% comfortable running that in the cloud either. So I think there's potential here for VMware. But of course, you know, time will tell what the community thinks coming out of VMware Explorer this year, because I'm sure, you know, for all of the keynote fun that we had with Hawk Tan, and of course, if you haven't watched the interview that he did with Daniel Newman and Patrick Moorhead, you should totally see that. I'm curious to see kind of what everybody else thinks, if they're going to be cutting the cord and just moving to the cloud wholesale, if they're going to be moving to another company that is not VMware by Broadcom. You know, I think we'll probably be seeing some news about that in the weeks after VMware Explorer. There's a new king of the mountain when it comes to backups, and the market share of the enterprise backup space has changed a little bit because Veeam is now the number one, at least according to Gartner. They have displaced the former leader, Veritas, who had been on top since Gartner started putting out this report. The market for enterprise backup grew over 5% last year, and out of all of the companies that they were tracking, Veeam had the biggest growth. The remaining companies did see growth overall, but it was definitely in the low single digits compared to Veeam's double-digit growth. It's exciting to have a new number one always, but what does this mean for the market overall?
Well, it is exciting, and this is one of those things that we've been watching for a while here, as Veeam has grown and grown and grown relative to the old standbys of the backup market, including, of course, Veritas, IBM, Commvault. And what this shows is that there still is a very, very robust data protection market out there. It shows that Veeam's strategy has worked very, very well. And it also, though, must be viewed in perspective, since we've already heard, as we talked about on Valentine's Day here on the rundown, that Cohesity is going to be acquiring the data protection assets of number two, Veritas, very soon, which theoretically would put a Cohesity / Veritas well out ahead of Veeam as the number one player in this market. It would really, really upset the apple cart to see that. In fact, frankly, it'll upset the apple cart even more than the fact that Veeam just passed Veritas to become number one temporarily here. I think it's important to note, too, that Cohesity is actually growing very, very rapidly. Even though they're not in the top five, they grew by almost 19% annually in terms of revenue. And as I said, they're about to grow a heck of a lot more by acquiring the data protection from Veritas. That would make them really kind of a number one with a bullet competitor for Veeam. And it's going to be interesting to see how those two work things out. Now, Commvault and Rubrik and the rest of the folks in this market, including, of course, powerhouses like IBM and Dell, are not going to take this lying down. They've all been investing very heavily and moving more into ransomware protection and security services. And I think that this shows, again, that this is a very, very viable and exciting market to watch, even though data protection has never been the most exciting topic. So good on you, Veeam. Very excited to see how you react to your new competitor that's coming soon. And I really am excited to see what happens with others in this market, especially companies like Commvault and Rubrik that are really coming on strong.
Well, Stephen, we had a bunch of stories we actually wanted to take a closer look at because, of course, it is hot chips this week. No, we're not talking about that whole one chip challenge thing where you have to handle it with gloves, but you are probably going to want some gloves to handle the hot chips that are coming out this week. There's a lot of news. Of course, a lot of it involves AI because that is the hot topic for the chip market this year. But let's start off by talking about a company that we saw all the way back at AI Field Day 3 in May of 2022, and that's Cerebras. They are doing wafer scale computing, and during Hot Chips, they announced that they have one of the biggest wafer scale computers that you can cut out of a round silicon mold, and it completely destroyed the NVIDIA H100 GPUs, thanks to a lot of high bandwidth memory.
Well, this is really kind of an interesting product. We were really blown away by Cerebras when we saw them at AI Field Day. It is very neat to see this thing in the field because, frankly, you're not used to seeing a silicon chip that's like that big. Uh, Most of the world of computing, especially high performance AI clusters, are built by basically ganging up lots and lots and lots and lots of individual units. Well, Cerebras takes that to the next level by leaving everything on the wafer. Now, you mentioned high bandwidth memory. High bandwidth memory is a specific technology that's used by the highest performance computing systems out there, including NVIDIA's GPUs, as well as Intel's best CPUs, and so on. Well, Cerebras is able to pass that by actually not using high bandwidth memory. Instead, they've got all the SRAM in the world accessible directly over this giant wafer. In other words, they're actually etching lots and lots of SRAM right there onto the same die as all of the compute accelerators, and they're able to access that with incredible, incredible bandwidth. They're able to fit actually an entire model into the SRAM on one giant wafer. And they're building this stuff out. They have deployed a few clusters of these things. We saw an early one, photos of it at least, in Santa Clara. But lately, they've built out even larger ones in Texas and Minnesota. And they're using these things historically to train models. But to me, the takeaway from Hot Chips was not training, it was inferencing. Everything is being shaken up. Now that we've basically built these massive, massive models, billions and billions of parameters, we've got things like ChatGPT and Llama and Grok that can do just incredible stuff. Now the choice is where do we run those models and how do we make them productive and practical? And that's what Cerebras is looking at here. They're talking about using this same chip for inferencing, which again, I feel like good on you. This could theoretically provide much, much lower latency since the entire model could be stored right there on the wafer scale chip. And it could provide a really, really rapid response for consumer facing applications. For example, future smartphone digital assistants, or in enterprise where you need really, really high throughput of queries. In other words, I need it to be able to perform inferencing on a very, very small scale of time so that I can stuff tons of those things through there. That's what they ought to be able to do with their wafer scale architecture. But of course, this is just the first of a number of different announcements that we've seen at Hot Chips, all relating to how do we make AI practical.
Well, I think you're onto something there, Stephen, because Microsoft is showing off their new MAIA Accelerator for Azure. I love this thing because basically what it is a purpose built AI accelerator for open AI workloads in Azure. Like, you can't get any more specific than that. It is their first generation custom AI accelerator. And like I said, it is dedicated to running OpenAI workloads, which we know that Microsoft has really invested in OpenAI recently. So, will companies want to pick this up, or are there going to be some concerns about Azure basically saying, hey, we would love it if you'd run OpenAI on our hardware and maybe reduce your cost not running NVIDIA? Do you think the NVIDIA folks will be happy with that?
Well, I definitely think NVIDIA will feel the heat from what Microsoft is doing. As we've talked about in in the past, OpenAI runs things like ChatGPT in Azure themselves. And so when you're using ChatGPT 4, it's probably running in the Azure data center. It had previously been running on a variety of different hardware, but this MAIA accelerator is very, very interesting because essentially, as you said, Microsoft has developed their own ASIC specifically designed to run OpenAI models efficiently in Azure. This is not a product. This is not something that they're going to be selling to third parties. Frankly, I don't even know if they're going to allow customers to use it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But the bottom line here is that Microsoft is really focused on making sure that they can run OpenAI's models efficiently and thus, I assume, profitably by using their own hardware. Now, another reason to develop their own hardware, of course, is because they are going to be reducing their requirements on NVIDIA hardware. That's been a challenge sometimes because it's difficult to compete with all the other buyers of NVIDIA hardware in order to be able to spec and build out data centers to run these models when everybody else wants that too. And another really interesting thing, as my friend Patrick Kennedy points out in the Serve the Home article that we'll link to, is that MAIA is not using the most advanced high bandwidth memory. They're actually using a previous generation of HBM, meaning that they're not actually trying to compete with NVIDIA and AMD in terms of procuring the most advanced memory chips, which again says to me that this is a lot about supply chain. This is a lot about making sure that they can provision enough chips and build out enough chips to meet customer demand from OpenAI rather than trying to build something that's another generation forward in terms of performance. Another thing that's interesting here, of course, is that Microsoft is not really talking about comparisons on a per watt or per dollar basis because this is all in house stuff. Why would they talk about that? What they're interested in here is their own internal efficiency. And the fact that Microsoft put all this time and effort and energy and built out this very, very cool product for their own use suggests to me that this is really going to have more to do with Microsoft's profitability and share price than anything else. So it is a very, very cool product going forward. And others are getting interested in developing their own AI ASICs as well.
You're absolutely right, Stephen. And one of the companies that goes out and makes a ton of ASICs is our friends over at Broadcom. And during Hot Chips, they showed off some of their new ASICs with optical attached devices. Now, for those of you who may not be 100% familiar with this, this is the culmination of a concept known as silicon photonics. One of the things that we've seen over the last few years is that as we start putting more and more devices on the boards of these servers, on these switches, on everything, is that we need to pass data back and forth, right? That's what those little copper traces are on all the silicon boards. Well, the problem is that it takes more and more power to run those things. And little physics lessons for you folks. When you add more power to the system, that energy that's created has to be bled off somehow. And that's how you get heat. And all the way back years ago at one of our networking field day events, Andy Bechtelsheim of Arista said that we are going to quickly hit a point where it's not the ability for us to send power to a unit that's going to be basically an event horizon. It's the heat that's generated from that unit. And we're already starting to see that. And what Broadcom is doing is kind of interesting. They're not just doing silicon photonics for the interconnects for the networking gear. They're actually using silicon photonics for chips, like the CPUs on the system. So imagine a co-packaged optic CPU that is using light pulses to trade data back and forth instead of using traditional copper. That to me is big because you've got to turn that corner. This is not a research project anymore. This is something that they are genuinely looking at doing. And they have a massive amount of data that shows just how important this is. Looking at the story that we're going to link, of course, from Serve the Home, one of the things that they talked about was the fact that the power consumption for a 200 gigabit module was about 13 to 15 watts. When they used co-packaged optics, they brought that down to 5 watts. So think about that. They reduced it to a third of its power consumption. You're probably sitting there thinking to yourself, wow, 15 watts to 5 watts, that's not a whole lot. I mean, my iPhone charges at 15 watts. Yeah, now imagine 128 iPhones all charging in a space the size of a shoebox. Imagine how hot that's going to get. Now imagine if it was a whole lot less heat intensive. That's what they're trying to do. It also reduces the power consumption overall in the switch, which means we don't have to have these dedicated nuclear reactors and water cooling. I mean, we kind of hinted at that with some of the other things. Even the Microsoft MAIA chip has a water cooling option, because what we're finding is that AI workloads are seriously driving the performance of these units. And one of the other cool things that I think Broadcom has kind of gotten onto their heads is they have a pluggable laser that goes into these co-packaged optics. So the laser can be replaced when it dies. Lasers are consumable parts, just like car tires and brakes and everything else. They're going to die. And some of the first generation of Intel's silicon photonic systems did not have replaceable lasers, which meant when the switch died, because the laser died, you had to toss the whole thing. You couldn't just go in and pull it and replace it. So I think Broadcom has an eye to upgradability, extensibility, repairability for these systems. And I think it's going to really drive the market forward. And I would not be shocked within the next 5 to 7 years that we see a lot of these high performance, hyperscale workloads going with co-packaged optics and even co-packaged CPUs using silicon photonics to drive performance to unparalleled heights. I mean, we're talking 10x performance increases that are projected over already wild performance specs, simply because we're trading out using electrical signals through copper for light pulses through optics. All right, another big story that we saw was from our friends over at IBM, because they are talking about using an on-chip DPU for big iron. And one of the things that we kind of heard maybe a little bit about when you were out at the Share conference earlier this month was about Telum 2 and Z17. And of course, our friend Stephen Dickens was able to talk to some IBM engineers about that in the Infrastructure Matters webcast. But Stephen, since you were there and you kind of heard what was going on, why is having an on-chip DPU so big and so important?
Well, the interesting thing about mainframe, first off, as we saw at Share, is that mainframe definitely is not dead. It is modernizing, it is embracing DevOps mentality, and it's embracing AI. Now, as you mentioned, there was a lot of buzz at Share about what IBM might do next. In fact, I kind of wish Share had been a month later so that we could have seen from or heard directly from IBM about the Z17 and where they're going next. Theoretically, that's what IBM is going to do with the processor that they showed at Hot Chips, because essentially that's what they did with the last one processor at Hot Chips 2021, which became the Z16, which is the current state of the art in mainframes. Now, the thing about mainframes, the thing to know about mainframes is that it's all about integration of diverse components and offload of workflows to different components within the system. The brilliance of mainframe is that it is all about this sort of offload aspect, and that's something that, of course, we're embracing in the non-mainframe world as well. But IBM has been doing this. Well, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but IBM has been doing this for a long time, and that's what makes their system special. So yeah, what we heard about from IBM at Hot Chips, and what our friend Stephen Dickens talked to Chris Berry and Susan Eichhoff about on Infrastructure Matters, is basically the next direction for IBM. And no surprise, they are embracing this whole idea of an XPU or DPU. They're embracing the idea of doing AI acceleration. IBM has been working in this field for a long time. They have a lot of credibility and clout in the AI world. And that's exactly what we're going to see in the next mainframe, I'm sure. Essentially, they're going to be doing the same thing that Amazon or Google or any of these other companies is doing by adding co-processors in there to handle AI acceleration. That's pretty cool because when it comes to enterprise workloads, or even, I guess, world class workloads, you could call them, the mainframe is still where it's at. So if you want to do inferencing against banking and financial data, or airline travel data, or things like that, well, it's all going to be happening on the mainframe. And instead of shipping that data off of there onto some other GPU cluster or something, you can actually do all that processing right there within the mainframe. And again, mainframes are focused on throughput and latency, essentially pull data through, process it quickly, and get it out the other side. And that's how literally the entire world's financial system works. And by adding a bit of AI acceleration to that, I think that we're going to get some really nice next generation products here built around mainframes. So it is interesting to be talking about mainframe in 2024, but boy, IBM's doing some really cool stuff here.
Speaking of, traditional tech companies who are betting big on new technology, we're seeing some more details around Intel's Gaudi 3. Now, of course, we're all waiting for Falcon Shores because that's the big AI chip, right? But we can't just pin our hopes on promises of what's going to be, because as we know, the beleaguered chip giant has been facing some headwinds. And as our own Daniel Newman said, they've got to land Gaudi. This has to happen. Otherwise, they really don't have a future in AI. But they started showing off some of the cool things that were in Gaudi for real at Hot Chips. But they have discussed Gaudi before at AI Field Day 3 back in May of 2022, and then also at AI Field Day back in February. So I'm kind of curious, Stephen, what is it about Gaudi that thinks, that Intel has a good place here in the market, or are they just kind of treading water until Falcon Shores can come out?
Well, it's interesting. I think that Intel has no choice but to tread water because, of course, they don't want to drown. And of course, most of the focus has been on NVIDIA processors for AI processing. The same is true, honestly, for companies like AMD, Marvell, Qualcomm, Broadcom, and yeah, smaller AI startups like, we talked about Cerebras and Grok. All of these products are actually really good products. And Intel with Gaudi 3 actually has a really solid inferencing platform here. Essentially, they've got a chip that works well. It's lower powered, it's lower cost, it's definitely competitive, it's available. The fact that this hasn't seen more uptake just shows the power of NVIDIA in this market. Essentially, NVIDIA dominates the AI space with their GPUs and associated chips, and everybody else is fighting over the scraps, including Big Daddy Intel. Now, Gaudi 3, Intel is doing the right thing here. They're basically going to hot chips and they're showing the promise of their platform, and it is extremely promising. They have a very, very solid product here. The problem is that customers just aren't buying as much of it as they, well, might, because frankly, everybody's so focused on the NVIDIA stack. So Intel has been investing in alternative software approaches and APIs to open the door to make it easier for people to run things on Gaudi. They're showing all of the cool capabilities they've got in here. I mean, Gaudi has some really neat things like video processing codecs, so they can process video and photo data much faster. It's got Ethernet connections, all sorts of capabilities that you might think would make Gaudi attractive to end customers. But the market has been, I think, a little slower to develop than many would have thought, including myself, in terms of turning that corner from training to inferencing. And frankly, when it comes to inferencing, a lot of folks are basically using whatever happens to be available in the cloud without really worrying about who's making the processor. So that has benefited companies like Microsoft and AWS and Google, but it hasn't really benefited companies like Intel as much as it could have. And most people aren't yet going out there and building their own inferencing clusters and so on. So I could see this as a very, very promising product. I could also see it as treading water. We'll see what happens with it. I think that if you are out there looking for an alternative for running production AI workloads, Guadi's an interesting hardware product, as well as some of the other competitors in this space, including Grok. But at the same time, it doesn't look like there's much of a market for that up till this point. I do expect that market to be developing. And for me, that's the big takeaway from hot chips, is that we are turning the corner and this market is developing. And I think that that is actually promising for companies like Intel and AMD and Grok and all the rest, as there potentially will be a new market for their products.
Well, Stephen, that was certainly a lot of news to cover from hot chips, but there's a lot of other things that we have coming up that are equally as hot. We have great Tech Field Day events lined up. The first one, of course, is one that is near and dear to your heart and is focused on a lot of the things that we've been talking about. Why don't you let people know a little bit about that one?
Sure. September 11th through 13th, we're going to be back in Silicon Valley for AI Field Day. And now we've been talking about AI Field Day all throughout this show and some of the presenters that are coming there. You will hear from some of those companies, in addition to one of them in Fabrica that had another hot chips announcement that I'm hoping to see focused on at AI Field Day. We're also going to be back the week after that for Edge Field Day 3. We've got a great lineup of companies in the Edge space, including OnLogic, Avasa, Zedata, VMware, and T-Second. And we're very excited to be seeing them September 18th and 19th. Then you're in here, Tom, with a special event.
You're right. We are going to be talking to our friends over at Nokia about some exciting data center networking news. They've got some announcements that they can't wait to share with us. I actually sat down and talked to a couple of our delegates, Bruno Wollman and Scott Robon, recently to kind of get their sense of how things are going in the data center market. Stay tuned for those interviews. Those will be coming out very soon, but make sure you set your calendar for September the 24th because they're going to be streaming all day with some exciting presentations, some wonderful thoughts around the industry, and of course, some of the smartest delegate practitioners out there. And then right after that, Stephen, you've got some more AI stuff coming up.
That's right. We're doing AI data infrastructure in October 2nd and 3rd, and frankly, maybe October 4th, given the amount of interest we've had in this event. We've already announced that Infinidat, Solidigm, and MAIA are going to be presenting at AI Data Infrastructure Field Day. But I intend to announce quite a few more companies that are going to be coming in for that one. So tune in October 2nd, 3rd, and maybe 4th for that. After that, we're going to be back with a bunch of other events. We've got Security Field Day, October 16th and 17th. We've got Cloud Field Day, October 23rd, 24th. And we've got a really big networking field day shaping up in November.
That's absolutely right. We keep adding more and more companies to this lineup, and the best way to figure out who's going to be there is to go over to techfieldday.com. You can see the presenters, you can see the delegates, you can see the schedules. One-stop shop for everything that you need to know. Just like the Gestalt IT Rundown is your one-stop shop for all things enterprise IT news. And we're going to be back next week with another great episode. If you can't watch us live, make sure you check us out on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Gestalt IT video. Make sure you check out gestaltit.com for the show notes. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast application. Sometimes I like to put it on to refresh my memory about some of the cool stuff that Steven's telling me about Intel or AI-focused computing whenever I'm driving to drop my kids off at school. But the other thing you can do is if you are a fan of the Futurum Group or TechStrong TV, you can catch all of our programs there as well because we are cross-posting them everywhere to let our audience know how cool it is to talk about the news. We'll be back next week with more great news stories, probably from, some hot chips news or maybe some VMware Explorer announcements. Who knows? It'll be a fun little grab bag. But one thing's for sure, we'll be back with more news and we'll have a little bit of fun with it. So make sure that you enjoy a glass of red wine and battle the forces of evil that have giant growing monsters, just like your friends, the Power Rangers. And we'll be back with another great episode of The Rundown next week.